before we dive in, it does feel appropriate to acknowledge that there's been an air of positivity reverberating from Capitol Hill in recent months. And as the industry does recover from its latest crypto winter, as seen in our in memoriam presentation, we've all seen the various legislative proposals that are now circulating through Congress. But after years of federal inaction, one is left to wonder if this time will be any different. And that is where the states come in. In the absence of legislation or effective regulation at the federal level, state governments across the US have stepped up to the plate to fill the void. But to put it simply, this has not been an easy task. Our aim today is to help you navigate the regulatory maze, but also to envision a future where blockchain technology can flourish while safeguarding the interests of both business and individuals. As former President Obama once said, a good piece of legislation is like a good sentence or a good piece of music. Everyone can recognize it. They say, huh, that works. It makes sense. So without any further ado, let's start off with a brief overview of the current state of blockchain and digital asset legislation at the state level. Cole, could you give us an overview of some of the legislative progress that has been made in Massachusetts, and perhaps comment on some of the great work that our sponsor, Cubic Labs, has been doing?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Cubic Labs and Boston Blockchain Week, for having us. And pinch hitting today for Rep. Cutler and Rep. Lippert-Garabedian. What I just want to start with is Rep. Cutler and Rep. Lippert-Garabedian last session started the House Blockchain Caucus in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And what that caucus does is it's an informal group of legislators who've come together and want to learn more about the blockchain and the crypto space from the industry, from regulators, from nonprofits, from quasi-state government agencies to come and really teach us what we ought to know about the landscape relative to blockchain. So we are in our second session now at the caucus. We've had a few meetings so far this session that just started in January. And so we are really learning from the industry about what you folks need and what we need to do as legislators and policymakers to create an atmosphere that is good for you folks. I will say Rep. Lippert-Garabedian and Rep. Cutler have filed a few pieces of legislation this session relative to blockchain. One, Rep. Lippert-Garabedian filed a bill that would create a special commission comprised of industry partners, policymakers, community advocates to take a holistic look in Massachusetts at what's going on in this space. That commission would then have to kind of create a special report back to the legislature. Those kind of reports, I think some people think, oh, they just go up on a shelf and don't do anything. But really, from the policymaking perspective, those are the types of reports that inform our next steps. And so that legislation is pending. It had a hearing back in July before the Information and Technology Committee. We're still kind of at the beginning of the legislative session. It's the first year of the two-year session, so legislation is having hearings now and hoping that those bills will advance come beginning of next year of 2024. And then just relative to Cubic Labs, we have a great partner in the legislature with them, but also with the Mass Tech Collaborative, who awarded them a grant a few years ago now. I think, Ian, I was there for their work. And so, those types of partnership between government and the industry are really important, especially from the perspective of Rep. Cutler and Rep. Lippert-Garabedian and the Blockchain Caucus.
That's excellent. Thank you, Cole. It sounds like a ton of progress has been made in Massachusetts and continues to be made. Joe, maybe you can speak to this. What are some key trends or developments that you're seeing at the state level in terms of regulation of blockchain and digital assets, and maybe focusing on your home state of California?
Sure, yeah. So California has been an interesting case study in regulation. So last year, there was Assembly Bill 2269, which would have regulated crypto at large. I think I was quoted as saying it was a bit license in a cheap disguise. Thankfully, Governor Newsom vetoed that one-size-fits-all bill. And we had another legislative session, although Assembly Chair Grayson, who was the author of last year's bill and this year's bill, reminded the governor that not long after he vetoed it, we had the FTX collapse. I don't think the two were necessarily related, but it just reminded the folks that this is important that we get wrap our arms around crypto and truly regulate the space at the state level. So this year, there were two bills that passed the legislature that are now currently sitting on the governor's desk. He has procedurally until October 14th to either sign or veto those and every other bill that's on his desk. I think there's 900 at this point. Assembly Bill 39 would regulate crypto exchanges at large, right? So if you do any sort of crypto exchanging activities, fiat to crypto, crypto to fiat, crypto to crypto, with minimal exception, you'd be regulated under that bill. And there was a separate bill, much more prescriptive, just for Bitcoin ATM operators, Senate Bill 401, which would create fee caps, transaction caps, and have prescriptive requirements in terms of what's on a transaction receipt and other disclosures at the time of transaction. And I want to sort of go on that one a little bit with SB 401, because that's where we see the states going much more prescriptive in what they want from crypto. So I think Ian did a good job of sort of saying we really don't have any clarification at the federal level. I think the states are picking up the slack, not just passing regulation at large in the case of AB 39, but looking at different areas of crypto and saying how can we be a little bit more prescriptive on different nuances that aren't in law. So Assembly Bill 39 actually takes up the issue of stablecoins and tells the regulatory agency, you have the approval process for what a stablecoin is. And unless until you, DFPI, Department of Financial Protection and Innovation in California, unless you approve of that, that stablecoin can't be listed or offered for exchange. So those types of nuances, those specific elements of crypto, we're going to see those more and more in legislative bills. And to the degree it's not legislated, it's going to come through the regulators taking a more nuanced approach, as opposed to saying, well, it's money transmission at the federal level, so we'll just regulate you like we regulate Western Union. Well, it's not going to work that way. Crypto's a little bit different.
Yeah. How would you handicap the likelihood of those bills being passed or written into law?
If there's something just this shy of 100%, that's where I'd put it.
Okay.
I think the governor politically has to sign that.
Great.
Governor Newsom's sort of a closeted crypto fan, but in the current environment and what's going on, I think both bills will be signed. And by the way, I think both bills actually were a really fair compromise, especially Assembly Bill 39. I think that Chair Assembly Grayson, I had the pleasure of meeting with on several occasions and brought some folks in from industry. He wanted to get it right from day one. And that's what we like to hear. I hear a lot of that going on in the Commonwealth. Let's get together, let's talk about this. It's okay to disagree, but let's put something out there that's a common sense piece of legislation. Everyone go, that makes sense. Kind of like you said about President Obama. That makes sense. Let's go with that, as opposed to this sort of tribalism of crypto good, crypto bad. And I think striking that balance is what we'll see. But yeah, I think both bills are going to be passed. And next year we're going to see another slate of bills, which I'm happy to talk about, but don't want to co-opt the conversation just yet.
I'm sure everyone will find you by the cocktail bar for that conversation. But thank you. It sounds like a lot of progress has really been made in California as well. But it goes without saying that regulators do face challenges in this space. Cole, maybe you can speak to some of the specific challenges that regulators face when crafting legislation for a rapidly evolving and complex technology like blockchain.
Yeah, sure. I think it's education. Admittedly myself, I'm not an expert on the blockchain or crypto or anything like that. Legislators, policymakers, we're presented with issues ranging from A to Z on a daily basis. Just this morning I was at a hearing on, disability rights in healthcare, and then I went to the Carpenters Union to see their training facility, and now I'm here talking about blockchain and crypto. So, policymakers are confronted with a myriad of issues spanning the gamut on a daily basis. And so I think, from our perspective as staff and as legislators here in the Commonwealth, being educated by the right folks is the most important piece. And that's where, the Blockchain Caucus has been a really important step in that direction by inviting, recognized professionals from the industry in to come and give their perspective to us has been really important from our perspective. And not only that, but, when we go to craft legislation, when that, at the beginning of the session, reaching out to them and saying, what can we do that would help your industry grow? What are the kind of things that you guys need when you look at, the general laws here in Massachusetts or the ecosystem here in Massachusetts, and what can we do to be helpful in that sense? So I think the biggest part is really education. There aren't too many blockchain-related pieces of legislation right now before the Massachusetts State Legislature. I'd say, maybe 5 to 10, just a handful, and I can see that growing, as the years progress, as people get, more educated, and I think there's a conception that it's, the older folks who don't understand it, but, again, I have a lot of colleagues who are my age or younger who also don't understand it, and we need that kind of expertise. We just simply can't know everything about every issue, and so we rely on folks like yourselves and the folks in this crowd to do that kind of work.
That's very true. And one of the reasons why, at least in my view, some folks have been slow to regulate this area is because of the fears around consumer protection.
Yeah.
Joe, maybe you can give us your thoughts on how can states strike the right balance between consumer protection and innovation. Do you have any thoughts about the idea of a state sandbox?
Yeah, so first on innovation and consumer protection, I don't think those terms should be mutually exclusive. I think that it's possible for them to coexist. When we look at consumer protection today, my concern is the capital C, capital P of consumer protection has sort of been co-opted as a brand for folks that don't like crypto.
Yep.
And they're using that as a way to say, well, think of the consumer, think of the consumer. And when we had these conversations in California, we were talking about Bitcoin ATM operators, we were talking about them earlier. They have any number of warning screens that appear before the transaction, and it seemed to us the lawmakers didn't want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about capping transactions or capping fees because they wanted to have a number and they wanted to have an achievement. And we were talking about, well, if it's about protecting the consumer, let's tell you what we've been doing for years. By the way, the prepaid card companies aren't doing this, but we are. And look at all the ways in which we're confronting this head on and making some successes and working with law enforcement. So, again, sort of getting off my soapbox on that, I think common sense consumer protection is just good for business in general, right? So if you want to have innovation, you want to have an industry, you want to have subsectors of that industry survive, they have to do right by their consumers. And I think that the two should coexist together and can. Regarding sandboxes, I'm always hesitant on that. I feel like that could be, in some ways the goalposts could move and it could become very pro-incumbent. So it's difficult without some very strict parameters early on. I think it's interesting to see some of the states sort of tinker with that model and maybe come up with something. I'm more of a fan of looking at this from workforce development or apprenticeships or something along that lines, as opposed to creating this sort of members-only club and allowing a handful of folks to get sort of a front row seat with regulators and with lawmakers.
Yep, totally agree. And it is interesting how a word like a term like consumer protection can become so weaponized when people need to latch on to something when they're opposed to an idea. Maybe to shift gears a little bit and talk about interstate coordination. Cole, in your experience, to what extent are the different states coordinating their efforts in regulating blockchain and digital assets, especially when these technologies often do cross state lines?
Sure, yeah. Look, I'll be the first to admit we copy a lot of, we see something good happening in another state where we certainly have to copy it. And I think a lot of people look at Massachusetts for a myriad of different issues and try to copy us to see what we're doing. And so, we're looking at states like Wyoming, Tennessee, Vermont that are passing, legislation relative to, corporate structure, blockchain LLCs, DAWA LLCs, things like that. We're not trying to recreate the wheel here. If something's working somewhere else, why wouldn't we take a look at that and see if we can implement that here in Massachusetts? There's a few organizations out there that we, the legislature, communicate with. They're national organizations, National Conference of State Legislatures and Council of State Governments that are large nonprofits that are great resources for us as policymakers because they take a holistic 50-state look at various issues across the spectrum and say, this is what's happening in X state in this issue. And so, the coordination, I'll admit I haven't reached out to the folks in Wyoming and had a conversation with them. Maybe that will come down the line. We certainly do that. But we are certainly looking at what other states are doing and saying, how can we, if it is working, if our industry partners say this is working in those other states, how can we take that model and implement that here in Massachusetts?
Yeah, we like to use the word adopting rather than copying, but it's a very legalese way of saying the same thing. Joe, do you have anything to add along those lines?
Sure, yeah, we saw that in California. So Assembly Chair Grayson, the author of AB 39, which will regulate crypto exchanges at large, they undertook a trip to New York and met with the NYDFS with regard to the bit license and said, okay, we're starting from zero. You started from zero back in 2015. What lessons learned? Their takeaway was they didn't hire enough people out of the gate, which I think was maybe a little hometown scoring, but at least they undertook that opportunity to reach out to other regulators and say, hey, what's worked for you, what hasn't, and then sort of reflect on that as part of the conversation. Tactically, when we get down to those that are regulated, the state examinations are quite coordinated in that the state examiners go together. Now, not all 50 states and the territories, but usually paired 4 or 5 so will get together for the larger institutions that have multi-state licenses, and they'll go out and conduct an examination together, and they get to learn from each other, bounce ideas off each other. And then there's the Money Transmitter Regulatory Authority Agency, MTRA. So it's an organization of all the state money transmitter regulators. They get together. It's sort of like the teacher's lounge, right? They talk about the troubled students and who's the star student in the class. But they get together, share best practices, coordinate exam schedules, and get to talk about some of the points of emphasis. Now, Clearly, things are going to be different politically between California and Alabama and other different states in between. But the idea is that they get on the same page in terms of lessons learned, knowledge, what is crypto, how does it work, what are these business models that we have to wrap our arms around. And so I'm very grateful for that coordinated effort and the outcomes that go along with that.
That's great. And along the lines of collaboration, one of the questions that I often hear my clients asking is how can they help to shape state-level policies to work not just in their favor, but to allow them to operate in the way that they conduct their business. Joe, maybe in your experience, how can stakeholders actively contribute when it comes to crafting state-level legislation?
Yeah, I think the first thing to think about is don't discount your voice, right? So anytime you meet with an elected official, it only takes a handful of folks, and I'm sure you know this quite well, Cole. Yeah. You get a handful of folks together in a state rep's office, that is enough to move the needle on an issue. You may not get exactly what you want or a vote or a bill, but it really moves the attention onto your particular issue. So don't discount yourself and don't discount the value of organizing within your sort of smaller crypto community. I'll tell you, in California with Senate Bill 401, I had the privilege of testifying before the Senate, before the committee on that. The kiosk operators or Bitcoin ATM operators, those guys and gals, they can't agree on the time of day, but yet they all seem to come together for this bill because the initial draft of the bill would have been a de facto ban. It would have capped the fees at 0 to 2% and capped transactions at $1,000. They would have all gone out of business, not because they were making less money, but because they would actually lose money. And so they put all of their competitive juices aside and just said, hey, look, we're not going to have a place to compete. We're not going to have an opportunity to hate each other if we don't have a business at the end of the day. So they're able to put that aside, get together, hire a lobbyist, and do it the right way and say, okay, we just need to educate lawmakers. We know we're going to be licensed. We know we're going to have to fulfill some obligations. We're here to play by the rules. But if you create rules that we can't operate in, unfortunately, we're going to go out of business, but you're going to open it up to the black and gray market. And we were able to make that case successfully, and ultimately the bill, though not perfect, ended up being a good compromise somewhere in the middle, as is so often the case.
That's really great to hear that you were successful in that regard. And Cole, maybe you could give us an example of a successful collaboration between state government and industry players to foster blockchain innovation?
Yeah, sure. And I do want to just comment on that last question as well. Don't be scared to call your state lawmakers. Usually you'll get someone like me on the phone who's generally pretty nice, but it is true. Seriously, calling us. Like I said before, we have so many issues on our plate. By calling your state lawmakers, and maybe it's a neighbor or a friend who has a similar interest, or an industry group that has a similar interest, having those conversations are really important to us. I can't tell you how many pieces of legislation we have filed because somebody reached out to us and said, hey, this is an issue, are you aware? And we say, no, can you educate us? And those conversations, while it doesn't happen overnight, as you mentioned, those conversations turn into legislation. And I think that's really, really important to not be fearful for sending an email or making a call to your state policymakers. Very often more often than not, they are your neighbors. They are more local than your federal officials, so they have a stake in the community. And I think that's really important to emphasize that point. Relative to some of the collaboration, I guess I can kind of go back to the blockchain caucus. Having industry partners come in and talk to us about the issues that they're facing. As I mentioned, we filed legislation, Rep. Cutler filed legislation this session relative to a DAO or a blockchain-based LLC. That idea came from a Boston-based company who said, look, other states are doing this. Why isn't Massachusetts doing this? Can we do this? And we said, I don't know what that is. Can you educate us? And they did. And they kind of sold us on that idea. And after a series of months going back and forth with drafting, we followed that legislation, and that legislation is now, I think it has a hearing in October, if I'm not mistaken, where we will be testifying, and we'll be asking our industry partners to come and testify in support of that legislation. So it's those very conversations. They called us, said, hey, we heard you had started this caucus. Can we talk about some of the issues that our company is facing? So those are the types of collaborations that, not only from an industry perspective, but as a constituent as well as an individual who lives in a state or who has local elected officials, those conversations should be happening, and we need those conversations.
So if anyone wants Cole's cell phone number for a personal request, he's going to be handing it out after this. Maybe now to switch to a topic that will resonate with many of the folks in the room, the impact on startups and small businesses. Joe, maybe you can kick off with how do state-level regulations affect startups and small businesses operating in the blockchain and digital asset space?
Sure, I think anytime you have regulation, it disproportionately benefits the incumbents and the larger players. I think we all kind of understand intuitively that that's the case. And now with the current environment in crypto, we're probably going to see less in the way of tax incentives and perks. We're not going to see a Mayor Suarez come up anytime soon, giving things away to the crypto space to try to lure them in. I think just creating a level playing field, right? So I sort of remove the sandbox and get into a place where the regulation is common sense, that we're charging a fee, because we have to, right, at the state level, for the application process, and asking information that is not only top of mind or can be readily produced, but is reasonable in terms of the ask, right, and not going over the top. So most business owners say the same thing. What are the rules and how do I play? I think if we approached it from that way, I think the startups will be in a position where they don't feel disadvantaged, but rather they feel like they're on a level playing field. Because most will tell you, look, we're not looking for a tax break, we're not looking for anything special treatment. We just want to have a clear path where it doesn't take months, or in the case of New York with the BIT license, years to get a license. We want to know, is our candidacy sound? Do we have the information we need? And what do you need from us? Because there's always going to be a back and forth. So yeah, my heart goes out to the startups. I mean, most of the crypto space is a startup, right? Because it's such a nascent industry. But we're going to continue to see competition. I hope that competition doesn't get scared away, because we're a little slower on the federal side, and that's maybe where the states come in. Again, not creating tax incentives or perks, but rather creating some really solid guardrails and saying, here's how you can come to market, and then getting those entrepreneurs to pull the trigger, so to speak, and move forward with their idea, move forward with their innovative system, innovative platform.
Cole, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think from Massachusetts' perspective, you also have to look at it, as competition, right? When you see other states that are starting to regulate, this space, I think of Wyoming, that are trying to draw business to them, that is a competitive disadvantage for Massachusetts, and I think for a lot of other states, and they need to kind of think about it in those terms, that, if there are other states that are ahead of the curve or ahead of your home state, they're going to be competing for those same startups and those same businesses to come to them rather than here. And, I think Massachusetts, especially, the Boston and the Quincy area are have an advantage given the kind of intellectual talent and the top universities that we have for these types of industries to thrive. But until we have a regulatory framework that is works for the industry, they may look at other states. It's an expensive state to operate in here in Massachusetts, and that's a competitive disadvantage. What can we do as policymakers to create an advantage and draw those companies, whether they be startups or larger companies, to Massachusetts to work and live?
That's really great. Now, as we start to wrap up, I wanted to spend a few minutes discussing with each of you the future outlook for state-level legislation of blockchain, as well as any opportunities that you see. So maybe to stick with you, Cole, what do you envision for the future of state-level legislation regarding blockchain and digital assets?
Yeah, I think in Massachusetts, again, it's relatively early, at least from my perspective, relative to legislation before the legislature. I mentioned Rep. Lippert-Garabedian's commission bill that Rep. Cutler co-filed with her. I think that's a really important piece of legislation, because it gives some legitimacy to the industry. It pulls in industry partners to have those conversations. It's a bill that would need to be voted on by the House, the Senate, and signed in by the governor. And when that kind of thing happens, I think it gives some legitimacy to what's going on. So those are the types of things that we're working on. But I still think it is in the early stages in educating, lawmakers, policymakers, and my colleagues, staff, and things like that at this moment.
Great. And Joe, are there any unique opportunities that state-level legislation provides for blockchain innovation, in your view, that might not be possible at the federal level? Or I guess generally, if you have any thoughts about the future outlook for blockchain legislation?
Sure. I guess getting back to being states in competition. So in California, our governor is fond of saying we're more like a country. So Singapore is our competition, not Massachusetts or Texas. But looking at ways in which we can sort of galvanize the entrepreneurs, get them to stay in that market. And I think I mentioned this before. Going the route of sort of apprenticeship or creating opportunities within the college and university system. So I had the pleasure of helping to write Senate Bill 711. Which ultimately died in appropriations, as most bills do, but we were enthused that it went that far through the process. And what the bill would have done was effectively create a working group within the California community college system, which is the largest university system in the world, and it would create blockchain curriculum, blockchain-based courses and opportunities for study, not just degree programs, but certificate programs, which are becoming more and more commonplace, more and more popular, both online and in person. Although the bill was defeated, there was a lot of energy behind it, and we got a lot of backing. Women in Data, largest organization of women data analysts, got behind it. Some various Chamber of Commerce organizations, and as well as the schools themselves. But as it turns out, the universities, like most of us, don't like to be told what to do. So there was a little bit of a back and forth there. And ultimately, we're sort of going back to the drawing board and looking at this more as workforce development through the grant process, which I think there's maybe some efforts going on in the Commonwealth as well, and in other states too, where they're looking at this saying, how can we get the work base up to where it needs to be, right? We're talking about reskills, retooling folks in the marketplace so that they can get into careers where there is an upside, where there is a livable wage, and there's an opportunity to excel. And we think that blockchain is one such space. So maybe not through the legislative route, but I think much more through the grant process, at least in our case in California and some of the other states we've heard of as well.
And Cole, I saw you nodding. Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, and I don't want to steal my boss's thunder, who's going on in about an hour, but he's filed legislation, again, with his co-chair relative to workforce development in the blockchain space, right? I think we see that there is a gap. How can we partner with universities? We met with the caucus met with WPI a few months ago over the summer, who were talking about some of the programs that they have in their business school surrounding blockchain. And so how can we partner with those, academia to create a space where folks can go and learn more about this? And I think it's especially important, especially given the younger generation who are far more educated than me on this and who are starting so much earlier in this kind of space, whether that be just generally trading or in the blockchain space. There's another bill filed that would direct the state treasurer to create, kind of going back to the consumer protection piece, a kind of an education, financial literacy on blockchain and crypto here in Massachusetts, kind of modeled after a financial literacy piece of legislation that was passed probably 5-10 years ago here in Massachusetts. So those are the types of things that we need to be thinking about as policymakers, is how can we partner not only with the industry but also academia to make sure that the folks that are going into college or even certificate programs have the opportunities to come into this industry and succeed.
I'll maybe just ask one more question here. If you could just wave a magic wand and any regulation, any legislation that you could dream up would be in effect 6 months from now in the state of California that's not currently in place or in the process, what would that be?
Oh goodness, in the state of California, where to begin? This magic wand could be dangerous. Yeah, I think maybe not so much on the legislative side, but my concern in California is operationally, okay, you're going from 0 to 100 miles an hour, meaning that in California right now, you don't have to register as a money transmitter if you're doing crypto exchanging activities. So they literally have no licensees, and they're going from 0 to 100. They're going to be inundated with hundreds and thousands of applications. And so what we've said through Chair Grayson's office is, look, you have to go to the DFPI, not necessarily put pressure on them, but tell them we want to see a public plan. What is your plan to process these applications? It's in the best interest of the consumers, it's in the best interest of taxpayers, and it's certainly in the best interest of the applicants, because their mindset of going from 0 to 100 is the BitLicense in New York. And I still have clients waiting 4 or 5 years right now for a BitLicense approval. Not because they're doing anything wrong, not because they forgot something, but because that's how long the process is taking and dragging on. And so let's put out a public plan. Let's all be on the same page. Let's all have that transparency. And I think at the end of the day, I will use my magic wand for not necessarily legislation, but how we act out and how we execute on that legislation.
I was going to say, it sounds like your magic wand would be to have the bureaucracy be efficient, which is quite the feat. Cole, anything that you would
We
do?
agree it's a magic wand, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I think especially just given the kind of beginning stages we in Massachusetts are at relative to legislation. And, I always get fearful as well. I think folks get very frustrated that the legislative process is so slow and can sometimes die just like that. But, there is an important aspect of it being slow that, I think we, especially the caucus that Rep. Cutler and Rep. Lippert-Garabedian co-chairs, we want to be deliberate. We want to be deliberate in our actions and not overreact to things that have happened in the past year. I think we want to make sure that we're making the correct decision, not just something that happens fast. So I always get a little nervous when you say magic wand like that, but I understand.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and I didn't mean to make anyone nervous. But thank you both, and as we conclude here today, I just wanted to encourage everyone in the audience to carry the ideas that have been shared up here on stage forward in your respective spheres of influence as we continue to work collaboratively, bridging the gap between innovation and regulation to harness the full potential of blockchain technology. So thank you once again for your participation, and let's all keep the conversation alive.
Thank you.
Thank you.